I'm pretty aware that a lot of you guys might not be that familiar with Contagious. So just to kind of set the scene a little bit, we're a marketing consultancy based here in London, about 40 people, basically fascinated by three key areas: marketing innovation, technology, and consumer culture, and especially what happens when those three areas all kind of intersect and collide and create really interesting new opportunities for people working at brands and advertising agencies around the world. So today, I get to talk to you guys about one of the subjects that is of clear and present importance to the whole industry right now, this area of computational creativity. So I really want to kick off by starting about this lady right here. Some of you guys might recognize her. It's Ada Lovelace, a woman who was, frankly, a bit of a badass. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, but Ada, really not that interested in poetry. She was obsessed by mathematics instead. And in 1840, it was Ada Lovelace here who wrote the first algorithm for a computer, making her the world's first computer programmer. So she also gives her name to something called the Lovelace test, which is basically a little bit like the Turing test, in as much as it's designed to reveal whether a computer is genuinely intelligent or not. But rather than testing that through natural language like the Turing test does, the Lovelace test is concerned with creativity instead. And in order to pass the Lovelace test, a computer has to demonstrate that it's intelligent by being able to create. Now, the test wasn't conceived by Ada here, but it's named after her because, well, Ada thought that computers originate nothing. They merely do that which we order them to do, which is a whole other thing. Now, for 100 years or so, she was absolutely right. Computers were tools to help us create, but then something happened that Ada didn't necessarily expect, and that was the advent of machine learning, a field of artificial intelligence that concerns computers that can learn without being programmed by human beings, a form of creativity, I would argue, in its own right. Now, our favorite example of this at Contagious is driverless cars. There is not a human being on God's green earth that knows how to program a driverless car, but we have them because of machine learning. The computers essentially figured out how to do it themselves. Now, if computers can create their own programs in that way, then they can originate things. So I would argue that yes, computers are capable of creativity. That's potentially game-changing for people working in our industry. But understandably, there are a lot of people out there who reject this idea outright. Even though the subject of computational creativity has been studied for decades now, with lots of work being done in the fields of poetry, music, gaming, storytelling, and also art. These paintings right here were created by a deep learning algorithm. But some people would say that these aren't true creativity and that this wouldn't pass the Lovelace test. And their argument is that rather than making something genuinely new, the computers are just recombining existing elements. And that is exactly what's happening with these particular pictures. They were, in fact, created by that deep learning algorithm, but based on an existing portrait of this guy right here, Professor Steve DePaula from the Simon Fraser University. Now, in the world of computational creativity, you see quite a lot of this kind of recombinatorial creativity going on, giving machines enough elements to create something new. One example that I'm especially attached to myself is a rap song. It's called speechtest.py. Really crappy title. But I'm going to play you a little bit of it now to see what you guys think. Take a look.
I'm in pajamas, but I just want my credit. If this party ain't got it, I'm killing this shit. There's only one girl on my rap bit. Keep it up, some goddammit, I'm killing this shit. And I'm feeling smooth as the chorus did. My homie called me like I owe her shit. But I need a girl who barely brought it.
Robbie Barrett is a high school student, and he got this project started by creating a form of artificial intelligence called a neural net. He then fed it 4,000 lines of Kanye West lyrics so that it would have something to work with, and left it to its own devices to come up with that alternative song in the style of Yeezy. Now, I don't know about you guys, but speech synthesizer aside, I've heard way stupider things come out of the mouth of Kanye West recently. So there is a little bit of credibility to this argument that simply cutting stuff up and recombining elements isn't true creativity. But on the other hand, there is absolutely an argument for saying that it bloody well is. William Burroughs, Kurt Cobain, David Bowie, T.S. Eliot, Tom York, all of these are creative people who have created new works using what is called the cut-up technique, often cutting up their own diaries, books, newspapers, previous lyrics to put them together in new and stimulating and provocative ways. In the 1964 book, The Act of Creation, the journalist Arthur Koestler examines a number of examples of innovation and discovery and concludes that the one thing they all have in common is what he calls bisociation, basically a joining together of two previously unrelated ideas. And it's the same theory that you will hear from Stephen Johnson in his book, Where Good Ideas Come From. The same theory you'll hear from David McAfee, the MIT professor who believes that combinatorial innovation is the best hope for the future of the entire economy and mankind. And it's the same theory that you'll hear from Matt Ridley, the author who describes creativity as what happens when ideas have sex. Two random ideas being enthusiastically smooshed together. Now, we actually see this happening all the time out in the real world, the taking of one idea and the fusing of it with another. For example, the original pitch for the film Alien was, of course, Jaws in space. So in this regard, the genetic algorithms that underpin computational creativity work in the same basic way as the human brain. Now, the other argument that computers can't pass the Lovelace test is that although they might be able to combine existing elements into something new, they aren't capable of the kind of outside-the-box, blue sky thinking that we venerate so much in the advertising industry. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. For example, if you gave an engineer the task of improving a jet engine, well, they might do things like look to reduce the weight of it, optimize the air intake, things like that, quite standard kind of approaches. But when the very same challenge was given to a machine learning algorithm, one of the solutions that it came up with was to reverse the flow of time, which feels like a pretty outside-the-box solution to me. Sometimes, though, what seems outside the box to humans might just simply be another valid result for a computer. For example, if you were looking for an example of this in practice, you could go back to 1956 when the 13-year-old chess prodigy Bobby Fischer beat the grandmaster Donald Byrne in a very highly publicized game of chess. Now, Bobby Fischer used moves that were hailed at the time as creative genius. He did all kinds of weird things like leaving his queen exposed to capture, sacrificing a knight. All of the experts were like, oh my God, this is insane. But if you put that very same game through a standard chess program today, the computer will use the same moves that Bobby Fischer did. But it's not doing that because it's been taught the Bobby Fischer way. It's doing that because it can calculate enough potential moves to know that those are the right ones to make at that particular time. They're the best ones. More recently, of course, we saw Google's AlphaGo artificial intelligence beat poor old Lee Sedol here at the Chinese board game of Go, not once, but I think like 4 or 5 times. And once again, experts reported that the computer was making moves that no human being had ever thought of or considered trying before. Now, what this kind of suggests to me is a new form of creativity. Now, while human beings might get to a creative answer through an intuitive, creative leap of imagination, computers can get to the same solution through methodical exploration of all of the potential options. Now, at the start, I mentioned the Turing test in passing. If you read Alan Turing's original essay, this guy is very, very concerned about people's inability to recognize new types of intelligence that is different from our own. His view was, however, that inability to imitate does not rule out intelligence. And I think we should apply the same kind of thinking to creativity as well. Just because computers don't produce in the same way that we do or work in exactly the same way that we work doesn't mean that they're not capable of creativity. Eric Brynjolfsson, a professor at MIT, has a really nice way of putting this. He says one man's creativity is another machine's brute force analysis. What all of this really implies, though, I think, is the need for a new definition of creativity in computational terms. And in fact, we already have such a definition. 3 AI researchers, as far back as the 1960s, were charged with coming up with a new way of thinking about this. And they came up with a number of criteria, one of the most important of which is this: an idea has to be novel and useful. Now, we all know what novel means, interestingly new, but to be useful, well, computers also need to be given constraints, because without the constraints, well, they can come up with really unbelievably novel ideas, things like reversing the flow of time, that aren't especially useful in the here and now. So figuring out how we manage those constraints is very important, though, because if we create too many limitations, then the output might not be as imaginative or as useful. We limit the creative possibilities. So it's a balance that we need to be very careful with. And we're already seeing companies that are working incredibly successfully within those parameters. For example, the software engineering giant Autodesk is using a type of computational creativity right now that they call generative design. We're going to take a little look at a video to see what they mean by that. See what you think.
What if you could come up with thousands of options for a single design without drawing, all of which meet specific goals set by the designer? And from those options, pick the one design that delivers on the most important criteria, the design you couldn't possibly have imagined. This is generative design, a technology that harnesses massive computing power, creating forms with precise amounts of material only where needed, achieving maximum performance while wasting nothing. But generative design can be about much more than simply turning out alternatives. Prototypes can be scanned and equipped with sensors that provide real-time performance data that can be looped back into the design process, so the object, in effect, co-designs itself.
Kind of crazy, isn't it? And I want to pick up on a couple of comments from the voiceover in that film. When you have objects that can co-design themselves, like this interesting looking car chassis right here, and designs that you couldn't possibly have imagined, like this weirdly organic looking accelerator pedal, then you've either got an insanely powerful creative tool at your disposal, or you've got a huge and pressing threat to the need for human creativity. And I think my argument is basically that you probably have both. Autodesk's Director of Research and Innovation believes that tools are making this leap from being passive to being generative, coming up with new designs all by themselves. So clearly, we're not in the realm of Kanye West lyrics anymore. We've got creativity defined as being novel and useful, and we've got designs that meet particular goals and constraints. And that all brings us very much closer to the universe of advertising and marketing, needing to find creative ideas that are useful for the goals of the brands that we're representing, and working within defined constraints, things like time pressure, budget, those kind of things that we wrestle with every single day. So let's talk about what this means for marketing. Specifically, we're going to think about what it means for one aspect of marketing in particular, TV and video content. And the reason for breaking off that particular aspect of the business that we're in is really kind of simple. This is global ad expenditure. Now, if you take out cinema, magazines, radio, and outdoor, since combined they only add up to about 18% of total ad spend, what you get is this. And if we extrapolate that just a little bit more, well, print is on course to crash out around about 2021. So what you're largely left with, well, it's TV and the internet. And as we all know, a lot of digital marketing right now is moving towards TV-like video content. So When we look at computational creativity as it relates to us in our industry, it kind of makes sense to look at its impact on creating that type of marketing. So, we're going to start by breaking down the creation of TV-like video content into some of its component parts. Now, it's worth saying up front, this is from a purely creative point of view. So we're assuming that the planning is all done up front and that the media buy will be taken care of kind of at the end. So once you have your amazing idea, what you need to make content, well, you need all of these things. You might need a narrative, a story, a script, lovely creative visuals, actors, maybe voiceover artists. You might need music for certain moments in the narrative, and you certainly need editors to cut it all together in an aesthetically pleasing, meaningful way. Typically, as we all know, all those jobs would have been taken care of by human beings, largely, according to this slide, middle-aged white male human beings. Leaving that particular issue aside, we're talking about writers, editors, directors, musicians, all those really interesting creative roles that we're very familiar with. But increasingly what we're seeing, of course, is a lot of technology becoming increasingly proficient in all of these areas. Now, for example, there have been efforts and projects to generate entire scripts using artificial intelligence, like this project Sunspring. This is a film that was generated by an artificial intelligence in order to be entered into a 48-hour film competition. Now, as part of that contest, there were certain lines and certain props that had to be included in the script. The AI that worked on this particular project was fed on a diet of science fiction movie scripts from the 80s and 90s, and basically had to produce the dialogue and the stage directions all by itself. The result, frankly, it's kind of bizarre. See what you think.
In a future with mass unemployment, young people are forced to sell blood. It's something I can do.
You should see the boy and shut up. I was the one who was going to be 100 years old.
I saw him again. The way you were sent to me, that was a big, honest idea. I am not a bright light.
Well, I have to go to the skull.
You guys all look justifiably mystified by that. I'd love to see what a film critic made of it, maybe Kermode and Mayo on their afternoon podcast. But given the constraints that Sunspring had, it's really kind of hard to judge whether that's any good at all or not. But if you did have to objectively judge it, well, there's technology for that too now. You could outsource it to computers, and that's where systems like Scriptbook come in. This is a company that has built an artificial intelligence and trained it on Hollywood scripts that have been proven successes at the box office. Now, what that means is that it's learned what works and can now identify those features. So you can run a script in the form of a standard PDF document through this system, and it will predict whether it should be produced or not, what the rating the audience would give it might be, how much money it's likely to make, and even how creative it is. So the proof of the pudding, of course, is in the comparison between the system, Scriptbook, and what human beings might do. So in order to test that out, the company took a sample of 62 scripts that had been produced and made into movies, and they ran them through the Scriptbook system to see how it would measure up. And the bottom line was this: Scriptbook system would have made as much money as the studio system, but it would also have saved millions of dollars by rejecting 22 scripts that ended up losing money at the box office. Now, pretty kind of interesting results and all kinds of implications for, well, what do we make and what do we not make, and the relative artistic merits. Anyway, back to the plot. We have now got our movie script. We've checked that it's good thanks to Scriptbook here. Now we need to bring it to life with visuals. Now, It's not going to be news to anybody here that computers are really great at this stuff. These are all CGI backgrounds from the 2015 Pixar film, The Good Dinosaur. And it's not news to anyone that computers are good at creating these amazing new photorealistic worlds. And also, increasingly, we're able to generate photorealistic animals and humans as well. Those dragons that we all love watching, sorry to break it to you folks, they're not real, just realistic. These talking wolves from the Jungle Book movie in 2016, also kind of fake too. Wolves just don't speak. Last year, or the year before now, I think, we had computers being used to recreate a young Carrie Fisher for the Rogue One movie. But giving these characters a voice, well, that's, still squarely in the realm of human beings, right? We need actors to provide voices for these characters. Well, maybe not for that much longer, because guess what? Computers are getting increasingly good, if you've been watching the news lately, at generating voices as well. One new startup that we love at Contagious claims that it's able to synthesize anybody's voice from just a 60-second clip of them speaking. Let's have a little listen.
Hey, Dodd, have you heard about this new technology?
Are you speaking about this new algorithm to copy voices?
Yes, it is developed by a startup called Lyrebird.
This is huge. They can make us say anything now, really anything.
The good news is that they will offer the technology to anyone.
This is huge. How does their technology work?
Hey guys, I think that they use deep learning and artificial neural networks.
Hillary is right, and I can tell you that their team is great.
I wish them good luck. I'm sure they will do a good job.
So, it's kind of impressive. Lyrebird was only founded in April of last year, and its product was launched onto the market, I guess, like late summer, early autumn. What's really fascinating about this technology is just a few weeks ago, a new project was announced. You might remember the amazing Ice Bucket Challenge project that was so huge across Facebook a couple of years ago. Well, Lyrebird is now helping the ALS Association to ensure that people who suffer from that horrible illness, once they lose their voices through the disease, are able to reclaim their very own speaking voice by using clips of audio that they saved from their healthier days. Pat Quinn, who was one of the original co-founders of the Ice Bucket Challenge and is a sufferer from ALS himself, was recently given back his voice, having lived with just a kind of Stephen Hawking-style recreation of that for several months. And he is overjoyed to be able to speak to people again in his authentic voice. So, where have we got to? We've got the script generator making a script book judging it, we've got visuals created by computers, and we have Lyrebird to voice the characters that we make as well. We've seen AI systems at Contagious that can edit film. This particular trailer for the movie Morgan was cut together by IBM's Watson supercomputer. And finally, of course, we also have systems out there now that can generate music. Companies like Juke Deck, who are amazing. You get to specify the kind of music that you want, the emotional feel and tenor that you want it to have, and the exact length of clip that you require. Now, if for some reason you have to recut your ad or recut your film, you just change the parameters that have been entered into the Juke Deck system, and it gives you a new clip exactly, again, tailored to your requirements. Incidentally, you own all the rights to that piece of music as well, so there's no forking out hundreds of thousands of dollars to Beyonce or Radiohead. Really a big step forward for a lot of people. Now, let's recap then. If when you're making content, you need all of these things up there on the screen behind me, it kind of starts to beg the question, do we actually need people at all? Well, I'm absolutely certain that a lot of you are sitting there thinking that, well, frankly, some of the examples I've shown you so far are nowhere near as good as human beings at all. And you're kind of right, but I wouldn't be getting too complacent about it just yet, because creativity has now crossed into the digital world, and that means that it's no longer subject to the same rate of improvement as when it was purely in the physical world. Ray Kurzweil reminds us that these technologies are now subject to the law of accelerating returns, and that kind of changes everything. Most people think that that basically comes down to Moore's law, but I think there's a bit of a misconception misconception around that. Moore's law is specifically concerned with hardware, the number of transistors on a circuit doubling every 2 years. And that is one of the forces at play here, but only one. Separate to that, there are huge improvements happening in software advances as well. And these improvements are arguably even more significant. The German scientist Martin Gretschel conducted a study into improvements in software and computing power over the last 15 years. He found a 1,000-fold improvement in hardware speeds. That's Moore's law, as we know, and that's massive. However, he found a 43,000-fold improvement in software performance. So think about it for a second. If you combine the improvement in hardware with the improvement in software, what you end up with is an exponential number, a 43 million-fold overall improvement. And the combination of those two forces basically means that JukeDeck, the music creation system, was making music that sounded like this in 2014. Which is kind of crappy, right? But by 2016, just 2 years later, it was starting to sound a bit more like this. So it can do more than just Ibiza floor fillers, but it gives you an idea of the improvement. So if you thought the quality of the examples that I've shown you so far has really been kind of ropey, that is going to dramatically improve because these companies are subject to the laws of the digital world now. And that's not all. There are other exponential forces at work in this particular field as well. Things like cost. Let me show you another example. This is ASCII Red, a supercomputer that when it was launched in 1996 was the world's fastest. It cost $55 million to develop this, and the machine itself occupied 1,600 square feet of space. Now, 10 years later, another supercomputer was launched with the same processing power for just $499. And it was small enough to fit nicely underneath your TV. The PS3, everybody. 10 years on from that, well, you can pick the same damn thing up for just £31 on eBay. What a bargain. Now, what's essentially happened is that over time, the cost of processing power has fallen away effectively to zero. And that, of course, is dramatically reducing the barriers to entry across this entire field. It's those plummeting costs that allow a company like Scriptbook to be better than human beings at assessing scripts within just 2 years of setting up, and despite being only staffed by, I think it's 8 or 9 people currently. It's those plummeting costs that allow a company like Lyrebird to be founded by 3 grad students. I think they've got 9 people on board now, and already they're doing like life-changing projects like Project Revoice. And it's all of those factors together, the plummeting costs and the exponential improvements in hardware and software, that have enabled the terrifyingly swift rise of deepfake, the AI-enabled practice of swapping celebrity faces onto the bodies of porn stars. All, of course, in a completely non-consensual and invasive way. That's pretty horrifying for people like Daisy Ridley here, star of Star Wars. Emma Watson as well has been a victim of this as well. This is real Daisy right here. And this is fake Daisy with her head grafted onto somebody else's body. Now, the Motherboard website broke this story in January this year. It's really well worth reading up on. And at that time, an expert suggested that within maybe a year or 2, fake celebrity pornography would be impossible to distinguish from the real thing. What has happened in reality is that that process only took 2 months. By March of this year, it was really just far too hard to tell between the two. And so we've got major platforms working very hard right now to see what they can do to crack down and regulate this and stop it from happening. All of these technologies are no longer prohibitively expensive, and they are getting better incredibly rapidly. The same, alas, cannot be said for human beings. Personally, I've never met a human being who got 43 million times better over the course of 15 years while their salary dropped away to absolutely nothing at all. Just doesn't happen for me in real life. Already, we're seeing these types of technology, of course, being applied to the world of marketing as well. LogoJoy is one example. It's a site that uses artificial intelligence to let anybody create a logo with just 5 clicks, and it does it all for just $65. We've got Picasso Labs doing amazing work using artificial intelligence to analyze a brand's visual marketing assets and advise them on which images are going to work best in their marketing. And we've got Persado, an extraordinary company using artificial intelligence to generate marketing copy that outperforms man-made messages 100% of the time. Now, all of this begs the question, should I be worried about my job? Well, let's not sugarcoat this. There's absolutely no doubt that automation has the potential to remove jobs from the economy. Let me give you an example. This is the Changying Precision Technology Company. These guys make mobile phones. Now, until quite recently, their factory was staffed by 650 workers. It replaced 90% of them with robots. Now, not only did that almost eliminate its wage bill, defects in its product dropped by an extraordinary 80%, while productivity was bumped up by a massive 250%. So that's robotic automation. Moving into the purely digital realm, well, we all know the example of Blockbuster, which used to employ around 60,000 people around the world, which has now been completely squashed into oblivion by the rise of Netflix, which employs people in the low kind of thousands, 2.4 thousand people roundabout now. Squarely in the marketing world, well, the lingerie brand Cosabella replaced its whole digital agency with an artificial intelligence called Albert. After 3 months, Albert had increased Cosabella's return on ad spend by 155% compared to the previous quarter. The marketing director of Cosabella said that nothing would persuade her to going back to using humans for that particular kind of marketing. Nothing would persuade her to do it. So all of that is kind of not great. But there is a reason to be optimistic. If you were paying attention to my presentation, you would have noticed that I performed a little bit of sort of clumsy sleight of hand round about here when we started talking about TV-style content, where I said, well, once you've got your idea, but where is your idea coming from? All of the systems that I've discussed today, they might be able to create and evaluate, but you need someone to initiate, to instigate a project. Someone has to decide that, yeah, you need some kind of a content. Somebody needs to decide the style, what you want it to do. Sci-fi, bank robbery, somebody needs to make those calls and have a good reason to be doing it. Somebody needs to have oversight and understand why the content is being created at all. Now, most people looking at the impact of computing on the future of jobs and the economy believe that a human being plus a computer always beats a computer working on its own. A computer beat the best human at chess 20 years ago, but still the very best computer can't beat a computer that's playing with a human being on its side as well. Now, although this talk has been about what feels like incredibly futuristic technology, I would urge you all to remember that all of these systems already exist. I've been talking about the present. So I wanted to end with some conclusions and a little bit of genuine future gazing to get you all thinking a little bit, 1 or 2 predictions. Now, number 1, computers are capable of creativity. I'm hoping that this is pretty obvious by now. I am not saying that the level of creativity is always all that, because frankly it's not yet, but that it exists. And it's only going to get better faster. In a few areas, we're already seeing computers outperforming human beings when it comes to creativity. And as I mentioned before, that just gets faster and faster and faster and faster. And This one, creativity is no longer subjective. This is a really, really big deal. For potentially the first time, I think, in history, what used to be a mixture of kind of gut feeling and lived, felt experience is now often a technology that can, in some areas, do better than human beings can. So if you're a creative that spends more time signing off and evaluating the work of other people rather than creating your own stuff, well, maybe now is the time to start feeling a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit worried about the future. Looking at how the future might actually play out, it's worth remembering that, as far as I'm aware right now, no integrated system currently exists for the end-to-end creation of marketing content. One possible future is that that kind of a system might never actually exist. And companies like Lyrebird, like Scriptbook, JukeDeck, they'll all just be available as independent entities who you can call on to deal with certain aspects of projects that you're working on. A second alternative is that agencies will develop their own in-house proprietary systems. But as the digital economy tends to favor a monopoly, I think a third scenario is a little bit more likely. And this is where we start thinking about companies like Google and companies like Facebook. These are big, wealthy organizations that already make most of their revenue from advertising dollars. They have a wealth of experience pre-existing in artificial technology and the money to spend on acquisitions of little startups and new players who excel in specific aspects of this very, very quickly, rapidly growing field of technology. I would also urge people to think about Alibaba, maybe Tencent in China as well. The amount of work these guys are doing with data is really giving them a head start when it comes to thinking about a unified marketing system that can also be highly personalized as well. Alibaba could be a really interesting play. They already have a system called Unimarketing that's incredibly good at targeting creative. So adding some additional elements to that feels like a really good idea for those guys. I think ultimately what will happen is that we'll see, once this integrated system begins to exist, a lot of creative work will inevitably move in-house, and these systems will be run by a handful of people who understand what they're working with, know which are the right data to input to the system, and be on hand to make creative judgment calls as and when those are required. So kind of interesting times ahead. Ultimately, I don't think that you're going to lose your jobs to a computer, but I think there is a distinct chance that you might lose your job to somebody who is better at working with computers than you are. The best advice I can give you is to be the person working with a computer that somebody else loses their job to. That's the goal. It's kind of bleak advice, isn't it? I think if you're a true creative, what it comes down to is this. You need to think of technology and these artificial intelligent systems as your new best friend, your new creative sidekick. Professor De Paula has a really nice way of putting it. He says, think of the computer as the ultimate open-ended musical instrument where we can put some of our cognitive stuff into the instrument itself. Now, I think it's a really, really brilliant analogy. Think about this guy, Skrillex, a music artist who is internationally acclaimed, multi-million selling all over the world, an incredible success. What instrument does that guy play? He plays the software, and I think it's very possible that in the future, either you guys will, or some of the people working for you at the very least, will do that too. Thank you very much.